Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the December NATS chat. I'm Kari Ragan, the moderator, and it is my great honor to welcome, oh, what perfect time, Ken Bozeman, who's about to pop on, I hope, and Lynn Maxfield, Dr. Lynn Maxfield, and Lynn Helding. And we are going to discuss defining evidence-based voice pedagogy, a new framework. Tonight is a bit unusual. It's the first time that I have used the NATS chat platform to promote my own work. So I hope that you'll forgive me for that. But I feel that EBVP, the framework for this that I authored, kind of transcends self-promotion. And as I've stated in our NATS conference presentation that I hope everyone watched tonight, my desire is that EBVP becomes common nomenclature in our field, because I do think it provides a foundation for every voice teacher to assess their approach and measure elements of their own efficacy as a teacher. I don't want to assume that everybody knows what we're talking about, that there has been an ongoing conversation. So I encourage you to look at the 2018 Journal of Singing for the original article by the same name. And then, of course, NATS has generously made available the presentation I did with my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Lynn Maxfield, Lynn Helding, and Ken Bozeman, where they graciously expanded each of the components. So I hope that you will watch that video that can be found on OfficialNATS YouTube channel. So as a reminder, we're just going to share my screen for a minute. I want to just briefly state the definition that I originally authored. Evidence-based voice pedagogy is the integration of voice teacher expertise and experience, student goals and perspectives, and relevant research into voice science and production to effectively evaluate and identify technical inefficiencies to guide students toward vocally healthy and efficient, stylistically accurate, and artistic performances. And it was modeled after EBM, which outlines patient values and expectations, best external evidence, and I'm so sorry, my thing is being covered, individual clinical expertise, and then also EBVP. So that is where this evidence-based voice pedagogy came from. And as we dive in here, I just want to say that when I first was writing the Vennard paper and then thought about this EBVP framework, it was because I oftentimes saw on social media people use evidence-based voice pedagogy and conflated it with science-based, all about the science evidence. Hi, Ken. Welcome. I'm going to let him continue to get settled and then keep going here. And when I discovered EBM, I realized that it wasn't just about the science and the research, that it is really those three components that live together to serve the needs of their patients and our voice students. So with that in mind, let's dive in just a little bit with the discussion. And I'm going to start a little bit in an interesting place. And it's perhaps an old and tired argument about the divisiveness in our field, or no longer divisiveness, as we'll discuss. For decades, there has been discussion regarding famous singers who moved toward teaching after an esteemed singing career and perhaps disparaged science versus the teacher who dedicated their life to the art of teaching. And part of the original intent of EBVP was to invite everyone to the table by providing this framework, to call everyone out, that they check that they are grounded in all three components. So let's start the conversation there. Lynn H., if you would like to launch us a little bit on this subject.
Sure, I'd be happy to launch. Yeah, this is a great topic. We've talked about this a lot among the four of us as colleagues, and when we meet at conferences and that sort of thing. And I actually just am taking a little bit of issue with that contention just to begin with, only because I'm hearkening back to Richard Miller's article, the voice voice teacher in the age of voice science, which was published in Bob Sadeloff's book. And I think the first time it was published was in the late 80s, maybe 1990. But it was clear from his tone that he was writing from a position of feeling, pretty alone as a science-based teacher, and sort of enduring the derision of colleagues, not necessarily colleagues at the place he taught, but I think he was speaking in a much larger way, sort of as you've set up here. And I'm just going to say that, that article was written 30 years ago now, which seems sort of astonishing to me that 1990 was 30 years ago, but that's what the math is telling me. And I think the good news is that we have done our work, and I just don't see that schism as much anymore. That was the first article I ever wrote, was a series of 2 articles about, art and science and finding common ground. And I was writing from that same perspective. And I even said things like going to conferences, and, the scientists would be on one side and the singer artist people would be on the other. And, you'd hear all this wailing and gnashing of teeth in the hotel bar afterwards about how people weren't able to speak together and speak the same language. But again, I think that's a very dated position, and I think the good news is that I think that it's really in their rear view mirror now. And I think what's more important now is to talk about that evidence-based, as you said, evidence-based vocal pedagogy is based on this paradigm from medicine, evidence-based medicine. And evidence is not synonymous with science. This is our problem, right? We conflate evidence with science. And what we're all here to talk about tonight is that evidence includes, as Cornelius Reed said many, many years predating this argument, what he called empiricism, or empirical evidence from his many decades as a teacher. And I'm going to just, Ken Bozeman has strong things to say about that, as does Lynn Maxfield. So I've just teed it up for you guys.
Thank you, Lynn. Ken, do you want to take it from there, and then we'll go to Lynn M?
Sure. Now that I'm calmed down a little bit from my technological problems here, can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's great. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah. We had to switch computers at the last minute. Yeah, so, we are promoting a science-informed pedagogy, but we also want pedagogy-informed science and performance-informed science and pedagogy. So they're really partners in this enterprise to be better teachers and to make singing better. I don't know. I unfortunately had to miss some of the pre-conference conversation on this topic, so I will weigh in with just a slightly contrary view. I do know that there are, I agree in general, things are moving forward, and more teachers are coming in that are open to all sources to base their teaching. There are still faculties on which there is not a lot of as much attention to the voice science piece of the equation. So there's still some of that still going on, but I do believe that there's no necessary dichotomy. I mean, we should be drawing from every possible resource to help us be better teachers. And so, however that plays out, in individual school situations will vary with the individuals there. The thing that I want to add into what Lynn was saying is teacher experience and expertise, which is my piece of the equation, is empirical, as Lynn was saying, and there are a lot of similarities with how, for example, science studies are done, and there's some key differences. We do come in with hypotheses. We come in with strategies that we're testing with students. We have a relatively robust cohort, number of subjects that we work with. We have good longitudinal experience with these subjects. So those, and we should be being as attentive and objective and assessing as any thoughtful person should be in a voice lesson. Some key differences. We don't have a control group. We're treating everybody that comes in. We are trying to make improvements with everybody that comes in. We can't narrow ourselves to a single protocol that we use on every student. In fact, we tailor the protocol to the needs of the presenting student. So we're constantly changing that. And it must be highly interactive. And even though we need to be thoughtful and objective in a certain sense, we actually have to be quite subjective in this sense. One of the key pieces in diagnosing ills is empathy. And empathy is not objective. You try to sense and feel what the student is doing in order to change the behavior. So there are some key differences. None of that, however, should weaken. In fact, I would say it strengthens our assessment of what's going on and our attempt to find strategies to improve a situation. And over time, we will see similar enough tasks or things that we're addressing that we will have, I would say, pretty strong, what's the fancy term is ecological validity. We find heuristic solutions, things that work. We may or may not understand all of the details under the hood as to why they work, and that's where science can come in sometimes and help us figure that piece out. But science didn't come in to tell us that it worked. We figured it out in our experience in the studio that these things are working, and we just need more, sometimes help in understanding the details underneath it. So it's all a partnership. It's just very much a partnership. The other point I would make is that in the sort of science and art discussion, good teaching and great singing predates voice science by quite a bit. Necessarily, we're not waiting for science to come in and explain to us how to teach singing. That's not the way it works. Science comes in, hopefully measures really good singing, which is always an issue. You want to make sure that the subject that you're looking at are doing the behaviors you're really interested in measuring, okay? And they help us understand in much more specificity and detail some of the things that are going on. But teaching and pedagogy necessarily has to be out in front of what we've had the time and capability of thoroughly vetting and assessing in the lab. We can't be limited. We have to be science informed, I feel. We really should be science informed without being science limited, because we have a job, a human being in front of us, and we have to treat that human being holistically rather than as a narrow controlled experiment. So it's very much a partnership of all of these factors, and science has helped us hugely. And I want to make sure that we're validating that. I mean, it's hugely important in my own development and career as a teacher. But the teacher experience and expertise, which gradually grows over time, is an equally valid piece of the equation.
Lynn Maxfield, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Oh, are you muted? Hang on, Lynn.
No, it's my fault. I muted myself because I have two lovely children who are and didn't want them to join the call unexpected. But getting back, that's right. Getting back to the question of whether or not we can move past the need to tiptoe around those who would not welcome a discussion of a more rigorous investigation of our field. I think we have. I think we're in a very good age right now where we can say we can investigate what we do. We can critically analyze it and assess it with the tools that we have in front of us, and move forward. And I think that the vast majority of our colleagues in the field welcome that type of scrutiny and criticism, critical assessment, as it were. but I think this is also an opportunity, switching gears just a little bit, this is an opportunity for me to step in and remind both our audience and the panel that voice science is not one of the three elements of evidence-based voice pedagogy. Voice research is, which is a much broader in application and in practice. So I just want to remind everybody that we're not, if the argument is we don't like science coming and telling us what to do, and if that were the old argument, that's dead in and of itself, just because we're not talking about only shaping our practice through the lens of scientific review. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And we'll delve into that a bit more, because I want to talk about the diagram that we came up with. Before we move to that, I just want to say that it's thrilling to me to be having this conversation in that, have we gone too far with science? Have we not gone far enough? Because when I was younger, that wouldn't have been the conversation. And I think that we're indebted to the great pedagogues, right? Sorry, I made a list so I wouldn't forget, because I'm of that age. The William Vennard, the Burton Coffin, Orrin Brown, Richard Miller, Ralph Appelman, Barbara Doscher, right? These are incredible pedagogues that wouldn't they love to know that there is a conversation now that is inclusive of all these components? Because even though they led us in the direction towards, hey guys, let's understand more facts about what's going on, right? They led our profession that way. You have to, I'm quite certain that they were all equally interested in student goals and perspectives, and using their own teacher experience and expertise in the application. So I think it's incredible to be having this conversation. And I want to say it, and Lynn Helding really made this point before we got online tonight, that NATS has really been a leader and is responsible, I think, for these changing conversations. Lynn H., did you want to, since you mentioned that earlier, did you want to expand on that thought? Oops, are you muted?
I'm just a little bit. I can. I would say a couple of things. I don't know. Am I?
Nope.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Yes. No. No. Okay. You have to let me know. This is a new platform. I have a couple of things I want to say about this. First of all, I love being in the middle of this discussion, right? This art science discussion. And, I don't think, I'm just going to say for the record, I really don't think in 21st century voice teaching, particularly in the Western world, that we get a get out of jail free card anymore about the science. I mean, I do think there are just basic fundamentals of science that every voice teacher in training now just has to know. And I try in my classes, rather than to state it that way, that you have to know, it's just, this stuff is so cool. This stuff is so amazing. I mean, the acoustics piece of it is so exciting and has really changed my teaching. The second thing I would say is that, there are singers who I think voice science, or I call it science-informed teaching, can just save people time. It saves time of making mistakes and trying things out. We can get people in a little bit more narrow lane and get the trajectory going a little bit sooner. I think that's one thing that I would say about that. But yeah, I think another piece of this that a word I've used for many years and noticed way back when, is that I think voice teachers do get a little bit tired of being hasty of what they experience as a sort of haranguing is the best word I can come up with. They feel harangued to learn voice science. And so, in the early days, there was a lot of, I'd love to learn this, but how? And again, I think our profession has done a really good job at providing summer workshops and those kinds of situations, so people can come and they can learn things at a rate that works for their lives. Let's just be honest, right? Once you've left graduate school and life becomes complicated, I just think that people who come to our workshops in the summer and leave behind job and family and kids and responsibilities, it's a lot of resources that are devoted sometimes even to come 2 or 3 days to something. And I'm just thrilled that more and more people are doing that with a positive attitude and trying to learn and change and grow, as we all are, which was partly why I introduced what I call the third pillar, right, which is the cognitive piece of it, because I felt strongly that after time, and I felt I saw myself doing this, and I gave it a name. So my name was the of accumulation, right? That we're just accumulating all this knowledge, and to what end? Because if I can't take that knowledge and translate it directly to the voice of my student, literally what good is all this scientific knowledge? And so it really, for me, started to become less about how much I knew and much more about how my student was receiving the information. And so I think our profession has changed hugely because of, as you said, those who came before, Bernard, Doscher. But even though, just to take those two for an example, they were translators, right? They took what was known at the time and directly translated it into their technique and into their teaching. And I think that's what we're all just talking about. So I think we could probably move on from that.
I do. Yes, and Michelle Capalbo has asked, what are the scientific fundamentals we must know? So let's just live with science for a little bit longer, because I also want to get to the diagram that Lynn M and I worked on. So let's live there and answer her question as briefly as we can. What are the scientific fundamentals we must know? And she specifically asked Lynn H, but I would kind of like
physiology and acoustics. Okay, physiology and acoustics. You got it. You got to know it.
Lynn M.
I completely agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, those are the areas, and you can maybe waffle a bit about how in depth you have to be on each of those, and how quickly you have to be able to rattle off the right names for each. But physiology and acoustics, you really need a pretty good understanding of them. I can't disagree.
I would, there are some others, but completely agree with that. I would add in, and maybe this is considered to be similar, but maybe would be psychoacoustics. And this actually would be moving the conversation towards what Lynn Helding was referring to. The physiology and acoustics is the know, as Lynn Helding has pointed out in her book, the know that, but the know how. We need to know how humans process all of this, how they perceive it, to begin to move into that, what do I tell the student about all of this so that they can actually do it? And the psychoacoustics of how we perceive and experience sound and experience our own voices leads the teacher closer and closer to that know-how piece of the equation. And it's been huge, the work that Ian Howell has done recently, and Shelley Valentine and others that are bringing in more and more from the psychoacoustics realm to marry together with the acoustics work that Donald Miller and some that I had done. It has been a wonderful boon to my own teaching. It's really moved me to, now I'm basically focused on the knowing how piece with students. That is, how do I implement this? How do I evoke these behaviors from students? How do they motivate that? And I can talk more about that a little bit later, but that would be the third piece I would add to the physiology, acoustics, psychoacoustics. The whole, and this gets into areas that colleagues like Heidi Moss is bringing in, how the brain is involved in this process. and motivating these things and motor learning that Lynn Helding and Lynn Maxfield have been very involved with, etc. So.
Yeah, the perception element has long been underserviced and to our detriment. I think we have sort of glossed over it to the level of like, oh, how does the cochlea work? We on a very surface level, but that next level is going to be very insightful. I completely agree that that perception has to be brought in, and I see this coming from the speech language pathology world as well. We've got to be bringing things back in the research in those realms back to perception, and I'm seeing it. It's starting to happen. So
we shy away from. I think we shied away from.
Then I want to modify my answer.
I think we shied away. Go ahead, Lynn.
Well, I just want to modify my answers. I don't think we shied away from it. I don't think it was there. So what I want to say is, and that was the paper that I gave that Kari's referring to, the Bernard Symposium. So my contribution there was to introduce that third pillar. So, you know, in my work, I've sort of traced the history of our field as starting with physiology, which came through medicine, through the medical field. Right, and then, you know, in the post-war period, we have the introduction of acoustics, right, and then that really sort of takes hold through Sundberg and Tietze, and then now, as we are getting into the 21st century, we start to see in the 90s the rise of cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience, doesn't matter how we put that. So we have those three pillars. And I would say the reason I was so quick to say physiology and acoustics is because those two bodies of knowledge have been around for a long time and are easily ascertained. And the newest piece, which is the cognitive science piece, is very new. And I think that's opened up a whole new, I call it a pillar, whole new shoot, whatever noun we want to give it. But I'm hoping that, you know, the next generation of voice pedagogues are going to take that piece and move it forward. And that includes the psychoacoustics part, but it also includes the huge branch of motor learning, you know, which is what we do. That's how we take our bodies and learn how to use them in an artful way.
Well, go ahead, Ken.
Oh,
the thing I was going to say about the avoiding it, the psychoacoustics piece, is because when you talk about perception, oh no, that's subjective. That's subjective information. We can't do that. We have to have objective information. Singing is pretty much utterly subjective. And, you know, we can't hide from that. And that's one thing, but also quite a bit of the psychoacoustics is actually not just subjective. I mean, this broadly shared perceptions that how humans hear and process sound. If that weren't the case, we could not match a vowel with a partner. You know, we can identify colors. Is that subjective? Well, there's ranges of things, but there's a lot of overlap and agreement as well in perception. So anyway, that's what I meant by I think we shied away from it for a while because we thought, oh, that's too subjective. Everybody feels it differently. And yes, there is something to that, but it is not that there's no common ground there at all. And this is what teachers use in the studio all the time. So I'm excited about bringing that piece in along with the pieces that Lynn Helding was referring to, which I have a lot to learn on myself.
Before I really do want to get to this one slide, but Julia Bentley is talking about does this conversation, does it dovetail with NATS careful efforts to map out what we agree on verbiage? And then she goes on to say her question would be, do you sense fundamental hesitation within this profession when faced with efforts to actually pin down these agreed upon components?
The
The conversation started a little bit, isn't it?
Well, one thing we could add here, just as a factual matter, before we get into opinion, is that we have tried that now several times. There was a part of the NARS Symposium was a pedagogy summit, in which we did try to come up with a, position statement that included, what is a voice? It was Miller's question. What does the voice teacher in the scientific age need to know, and therefore what do they need to teach? And it was an exhausting 2 days where about 50 people put their heads together, and we're still kind of wrestling with that, where we landed. So there have been attempts to do that, but it's a I mean, can you imagine 50 voice teachers?
Yes,
in
I
the
can,
room?
because we were all there.
I know. I'm talking to Julia. Hi, Julia. But it was fascinating. I mean, it was fascinating how much agreement. Here's what I remember. There was a lot of agreement. Yeah. The problem was not disagreement. And I'm going to cede maybe to Lynn Maxfield, who was also there. The problem was, because we're teachers, we kept saying, oh, and this, oh, and that, oh, and we need to have that. Oh, you can't be a good teacher if you don't do this. And suddenly we started laughing at ourselves. We were like, we've just created a superhuman that doesn't exist unless this person never has a personal life or gets any sleep. That's what I remember. We had everything in there.
That's exactly what I remember as well. It wasn't that we had too few things that we agreed upon. It was that we agreed on almost the essentialness of all of it, and that's unrealistic. Exactly.
I remember
that, but not until this afternoon of the second day. I think.
And I remember the bits about the nuance of language. That a bunch of 58 academics in a room with the nuance of language, not disagreements on semantics necessarily, but the nuance of the language to describe what we all agreed on. That was what stood out to me as being fascinating. Yeah. Well, before we leave this, one last thing. So Lynn, I wanted to say, Lynn M, that one of my favorite things to come out of the EBVP is this broader understanding about voice research and what it means, and how in our field, the breadth of inclusion from voice science to arts and humanities. And I just want you to lead that bit of the discussion. Your presentation was so interesting and informative to me, and then I'll show the slide whenever you would like me to.
Yeah, sure. And I'll just speak briefly about the process that I took here, and then we'll open this up to a little bit more discussion on it. But I completed a PhD at Iowa, and it was sort of a split degree. It was granted through the School of Music, obviously, but I split my coursework and my dissertation work between the School of Music and the Communication Sciences Disorders Department. And I was the first one to complete that degree, and so I was finding my ground through that. And what we realized, my advisor and I, was that the only other PhDs programs in the School of Music were in musicology and in music theory. And yet I was trying to design, and was being expected to design, a dissertation project that was scientific. And the language used to define these programs was very similar, talking about research. But the way that the word research was understood in the two contexts was quite different. And what I like here is that we've been able to, in EBVP, to marry those two a bit more, and say all of this research, these different kinds of research, are relevant to the practice of voice pedagogy. So, I came back as I was wrestling through how I was going to discuss this. I came back to the University of Washington. Actually, their English department has this great webpage about how they define research in the humanities, and they say we miss so much about research if we only define research as discovering something completely new, rather than a process just like the scientific process is a process, research is a process, and part of that can include reinterpretation from a critical or a creative standpoint to generate something new in the end. And so the way that we have conceptualized research is that there is scientific research and there is research in the humanities that is somewhat less scientific in its nature. And Kari, you can probably put that image up if you would like at this point.
Well, let me go to this.
And oh, actually, go to the one previous. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that. Go ahead, Lynn. You talk about.
Yeah. So in evidence-based medicine, right? They take their research component and they create this hierarchy of how you can assess the usefulness of different types of the research in the literature. And Kari and I went back and forth a long time trying to figure out how to make shoehorn voice pedagogy into this pyramid. And it goes back to exactly what Ken was talking about a bit ago, that what we have to evaluate as voice teachers is much more subjective than what a doctor, a physician has to evaluate. You know, health outcomes can be quite quantitative and not subjective at all. They can be quite objective, but we don't get that luxury. And so this hierarchy just didn't quite fit what we needed. So we came to a much more artsy version that includes everything, basically. And voice research then is very broadly defined as all the research that is relevant to our practice. And that's a huge amount of information. It's a hugely broad scope of fields, and that's okay. So then the question I guess I still have is, how much of an expert can any of us purport to be in all of it? And I don't think we can. I don't think we can be much of an expert, but maybe we practice, you know, being jacks of all trades, Jills of all trades, and master of as many as we can. Mm-hmm. And that's about as good as we can get. So we did define this, divide this up into voice science and then the research in the arts and the humanities. And there may be some more overlap with both the student perspective and the teacher perspective. But that's the great thing, is that's what the Venn diagram does, is it focuses on the overlap. And there certainly is research that is not as controlled, is not prospective or even retrospectively designed. But I completely agree that so much of what we do in the studio is research. It's just always a single subject case study, you know, that you're trying your best to get the best outcome regardless of what tool. And every time you get to that outcome or don't, you file that bit of information away and you draw on it on the next student. And that is, in the broad definition, research. It is in systematic poking and prodding at the question.
I love that. Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to stop sharing our screen. Before we leave this component, I'm going to give Dr. Ingo Tietze the last word, because he has joined us tonight. So I was honored to see him pop up in the question box. And he states, careful studies in psychoacoustics have been around for a lot longer than we think. It has been mainstream in music acoustics, but instrumentalists have dominated that territory. Vocalists don't show up in psychoacoustic sessions at the Acoustical Society. So as we put it—
don't show up at the Acoustical Society.
Say that, what was that, Lynn?
Vocalists don't show up at the Acoustical Society. In the perceptual section. And we need to. We absolutely need to.
Well, I love that. And we will hear more from Dr. Tietze in May when he is my guest on the NATS chat then. So Ken Bozeman, we are going to move into the teacher experience expertise a little bit, but as everyone can see, you know, there's no way to talk about these components as single units, right? There is this incredible intersection of all three. So we've already talked about some of that, but Ken, will you just quickly, you know, identify as we're expanding the teacher experience, you know, what we've identified as three important components within that component?
Well, it's the the area is called teacher experience and expertise. Excuse me. And the experience part involves your own personal vocal journey, because typically your pedagogy is going to grow out of your own learning how to use your own instrument. So there's your personal journey of learning. Then when you're engaging in that, you also usually are in some context where you're noticing the personal vocal journeys of some peers. So you're gathering information of how this works from their personal journeys as well. So from your teacher, your own personal journey, which is ongoing and essentially lifelong, but a good deal of it needs to happen at the front end. Then the second piece was performance experience. Both of those are, you could say they're both your experience as a performer, but I wanted to separate out as a learner and the performer, because there are things you learn in the performance context that are different from what you learn, as we know also from Lynn Helding's work. Performing and learning are two different activities, you know. So you learn in the performance context how to manage situations that occur on the fly in the moment, and you know, how do I, they're in preparing a performance, getting it ready, then doing it, the venue, the acoustics of the venue, many things go on that you learn from being a performer, in addition to what you learned as being a learner, a vocal learner, getting to that place. So that's your personal journey. Of course, you're getting input from your mentors, your teachers, your peers, hopefully from reading in all of these other areas that we've talked about. Hopefully you start reading great historic pedagogic resources, voice science resources, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the key piece then is, once you've uploaded as much as you can before you actually start teaching, then you have the teacher experience. And that one-on-one, to some extent, experimental trial and error, but it's not blind trial and error. You already have accumulated a lot of information from your own journey that I was referring to. Over time, you learn things there that you just can't learn any other way. You know, you can't just consult a book and now I'm going to do this. No, it's an interactive, highly personalized and intuitive and empathic process. I love a quote that I hope she won't mind my using in a conversation I had with Kitty Bertolini, who said to me that she, and people probably know who Kitty is, she's a wonderful researcher in SLP, a teacher of SLPs. And she went on a project to determine what the best practitioners that she knew of did, what made them good. And she said several things. One was, the main thing that they all had in common was they were all good. And another thing was they had to be present. Well, we know what that is as a teacher. It's really hard to define that, but it has to do with that empathic, very attentive, being there in the moment and really observing and hearing and sensing what is going on in front of you, so that you can begin to assess what to do based on all of this learning that you've done up to that point in time. And there was another one that was very important, and I just lost my train of thought. Maybe it will come back to me. Hold on a second. Oh, this was it. This was the stunning quote. And Kitty, I hope it's okay that I share this, because I think it was fabulous. So she asked one of these wonderful practitioners, so how do you know what strategies you're going to use with a particular client that comes in? This is a, you know, probably rehabilitation work, but I think it applies to habilitation work as well. And the person said this: I see, and then I know. And it basically comes down to that, because once you have built in all of that knowledge and experience, which actually they probably didn't feel that way the first time they faced a client, okay? But after years of assessing and responding and attentive and being very present and doing it, that's what happens. And we almost don't necessarily know in a checklist way how we make that assessment sometimes, because it's become so much a part of who we are in our process in the studio. And that, that may sound, how do you teach that? Okay. But it is a process. So this is what the teacher experience component is. You learn things when you're working with human beings to help them improve whatever it is you're working with them on, that can't be gotten any other way. And we need to find a way to validate and celebrate that. And hopefully, how can we help that process along, learn better how to help that piece of the process along. So that's the teacher experience and expertise that is the culmination. The expertise is the culmination of all of those pieces. Definitely draws on everything that's been said. I'll give one personal example. I noticed in 1989 that vowels in my voice wanted to transition, what I call turnover, not at the same pitch. And I began to notice a pattern that paralleled first format locations that I had seen in voice science texts. So I took the piece from the voice science, but it was in the studio and in the practice room that I began to notice, oh my goodness, there is a parallel relationship between these acoustic events and first format locations. To my knowledge, this had not been pointed out anywhere. I thought, this is kind of obvious. Why haven't I read this somewhere? Could well be that I just don't read enough, okay? But I don't think that was out there. Well, it turns out that Donald Miller and Herm Schutter were beginning to notice the same things at about the same time, and were beginning to research it in Groningen. That was a case of pairing some information that I gleaned from voice science with what I was experiencing in my learning process in the practice room in the studio to come up with something that turned out to be useful in pedagogy. So this is how I see this process and this conversation going forward. It's mine.
I love that, Ken. Thank you. And I have to say, I really debated about the word expertise. I was going off of EBM, which identifies individual clinical expertise, right? And but in our field, I really, every time I use that word or I hear that word, I think, gosh, I'm an advanced learner, not an expert, because I feel like the more I learn, the more I don't know. So I did debate that, but I love, Ken, how you honed in on, as you started to expand this, those three: personal training experience, performance experience, teaching experience, which all lead to this expertise or advanced learning. Just didn't fit in the bubble very well. So we went with expertise, but Lynn M or Lynn H, anything within that component specifically of what Ken has shared that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would just say, I think expertise is a great word because we have a whole field now dedicated to it, and it is called expertise studies. That's where the 10,000 hour practice rule comes from, for example. So, but in order to get to work around what you've said, Kari, I sometimes say expertise, experts, and expertise seekers.
Oh, thank you. Leave it to you.
Those of us who wish to be that, or the other way, the cheeky way of saying it is, how many hours of practice does it take to become an expert? About 10,000 over 10 years. And then the next question is, well, what if I want to be pretty good? 7,000. Right? So there are definitely, gradations of that. But
having the 2,000 hour range. What's
we don't have any time for that. That's me in golf right there. But I think the issue really is, what can we learn from expertise studies? What can we learn, right, from people who are in athletics, for example, you know, we ourselves may never be, you know, these gold medal Olympic athletes, but we can learn a lot from the way they train, right, and how they think about how they train. So the expertise studies is really built on it's not that the people who created that field are experts themselves. They're just fascinated with how people reach their ultimate goals, which I think is all of us. So that's I'll add there.
Lynn M, anything specifically from your experience?
Not to add to what either of those two have already brilliantly said. No,
Okay.
I have enough expertise to know not to say.
That it's been stated. Well, and that whole component, we could spend 3 hours just talking about all of our own individual experience within those 3 ideas, right? I mean, that's what makes up what's led us to be where we are now, you know. So let's delve a little bit and discuss the inclusion of student goals and perspectives. And again, when I came across this EBM and saw the Venn diagram, and had myself always conflated evidence-based with science, and saw that EBM included these 3 components, I was so inspired by that. I thought, oh, so the doctors are supposed to think about patient values and preferences. Wow, you know, I don't know what it says that I wasn't aware that that was part of EBM, but that's another conversation. And so then I chose to translate that to student goals and perspectives. And I think it is such an important component, and especially for those of us who are a bit older and come from teachers where we just shut up and did what we were told, right? We didn't ask questions. We didn't ever go in and say, gosh, my throat feels a little sore today, or I'm not understanding what you're wanting of me, or how can I learn better, right? We didn't, at least I didn't. So what did I want to say? That's such an important component, because it's a reminder that being an effective teacher is not only about our vast knowledge and experience, but all of that is only as good as honoring the individual in front of us. So do you feel the EBVP will help teachers to reevaluate their approach with that regard? And just, yeah, Lynn H, I'll turn to you to kind of share what you'd like. I know we need to talk about learning. We need to talk about.
Well, but I think this is hugely important. And I actually have already said a few things about this. So I'll just remind, I mean, what's already been said tonight. You know, first of all, you know, learning is a partnership. It absolutely is a partnership. I mean, we have all these old sayings, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. These are truisms, right? So we know that there are certain things that have to be evident in the learner, you know, and you learn that as a parent, for example. And you can want everything in the world for your child, and if they are not willing to let it in, it is just not going to happen. So, you know, this studio, we're talking about voice teaching tonight. We're talking about a partnership, right? And so I said earlier, you know, in my view, science-informed teaching means that we do not get a get-out-of-jail-free card. We must learn our whole lives long about voice science, which is, you know, the physiology, the acoustics piece, and then now the cognitive science piece, how people learn. So that's this piece is then looking at, you know, some older ways of doing things, which I would call, you know, what you just described, Kari. That's kind of a tough love, right, approach, which says, I am the master, you are not. You will do what I say, and if you ask me any questions, you're sort of challenging my authority, right? And so one of the things that I just talked about with my pedagogy class this semester is tough love just doesn't work. You know, regardless of whether we think that it oughta, coulda, shoulda, woulda, it doesn't. And so we have to find, you know, we have to sort of look at some new ways of thinking about things that human beings have known some of this stuff for a very long time. So what's required for learning? Well, before we have attention, learning itself, and memory, which are the three components of learning, there's this pre-attentional phase, which includes volition, which is just a fancy word for wanting to. So if you don't want to learn, it's just not going to happen, or it's going to be very corrupted on the way in, right? If we're not, if we don't want this thing to happen. So understanding, I think, some of those, this is a conversation I have with my pedagogy students who are teaching, let's say, high school kids who may be in their studio not because they want to be, but because their parents want them to be. So we've had some fascinating discussions in my pedagogy class about that cohort, which is interesting to me because I don't teach that cohort. So, but my students do, and they're just starting out. So I think that's sort of an important piece of this, is just beginning to look at some of the things that we've known for a very long time about how people learn, and now knowing and then leveraging some newer research on how people learn best, right? So how can we change old habits? You know, so one of the old habits I would change is this, as you had described, Kari, you know, that way of doing things is just not very effective. One of the things, speaking of Kitty Verlini, that I was fascinated to learn from her some time ago, and I think it was the World Health Organization, it's in my book, I should remember this, but you know, when all things are, when we look at compliance studies, which is the word which is used in medicine for how well people follow their doctors and therapists' orders, right? How well do we adhere to the get well routine, whether it's therapy or taking our medicine on time? Compliance is the old word. The new word now is adherence. How well do we adhere? And when you take all things and put them together, the one thing that comes above all other reasons that people adhere to the masters, in this case the physician's orders, is physician warmth. And that is translated as how well does the patient, client, student in our case, believe that the physician, clinician, teacher wants them to succeed, wants them to get better. And I have come to, I say this in my pedagogy class, you do have to want that for your client and student at some level, although it can never be out of scale from their own volition. And I've said that to many a student too, for whom it was not working. My way of saying it is, you have to want this more for yourself than I want it for you. Right? But we know that there has to be a certain level of investment among both parties for this learning thing to come to some kind of fruition. Now, all of us probably could come up with terrible tales of when that's out of balance, right? And so I'm not saying that there's any perfect symbiosis there, but I think we have to try for it. And I think, you know, some of my students have talked about, well, what happens if you just have a student you don't like very much, or, you know, you're not getting along with them. You know, of course, we could talk about those stories too, but at the bottom, at the most basic thing is this thing that we all share and do is a human response. It's a human emotion. And if you can look at someone as human to human, that's where you begin. That's what allows us to enter into that partnership for them, and as Ken mentioned the word empathy, right? Empathetic way that helps them get to the next level, or helps them, gives them the tools to speak what's in their heart, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of amazing things that are coming out of cognitive science research that both affirm sort of folk wisdom, if you will, and also give us some new tools for how we can help people along their journey as a better singer in this case.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Ken or Lynn M., anything you'd like to add to that wonderful information, thought process?
I'll let Lynn start since he's a motor learning researcher.
Fair enough. How do you add to Lynn Helding? But there's not much to add there. But something you said there at the end about, science or the research reaffirming the folk wisdom or something like that. This brings me. This is something I've been kind of rolling around in my head all evening here. So apologies if it's not entirely well formed. But I'm going to say in vocology, where we're studying human vocalization, there is the idea of conducting the research, but there's also the element of applying the research. And I think oftentimes the two get conflated. And we think in order to apply the research, I have to be designing studies. And I don't think that, in fact, I know that that's not the case. That's not what we need. And so sometimes the science needs to and the research needs to just answer the question that it finds. And if the answer to that is applicable and relevant, then wonderful. And if it's not, that's okay too, because that's basic science. That's basic research. That's fundamental. It will go into our collective understanding, and it will pop out into its translation at some point, into its application at some point. And I kind of went around this on a doctoral defense earlier this week, where one of the questions that came up with my student was, so what? Why? And I had to say, well, we can't always put the value of this investigation immediately on its immediate application. I think that sells our field and our practice short. Sometimes we have to investigate for curiosity's sake, and that's okay. And sometimes too, we have to be mindful. I completely understand the idea of pedagogy informed science, and it's necessary, but so is just pedagogically uninformed science. If the opposite of that is also valuable, and it will find its value maybe not even in this field. And so we have to just, maybe I'm feeling like voice science still gets kicked a bit, and so I'm feeling a bit defensive on it. But I think that we need to validate that and its value in and of itself, to make sure that we're not leading the evidence to what we want it to be. Be careful that it doesn't become industry supported research, right? Industry funded research, which we immediately kind of just question. It's not that you don't believe it, but you question it with a little bit more rigor. So that kind of went off from what Lynn Helding was saying, but hopefully it's related enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ken, you look like you have, yeah.
Sure. I've made the comment that, first of all,
oh no.
He's frozen.
Oh, we did so well.
We did.
He'll come back. Come on back. Lovely free. Well, while we're waiting for him to come back, let me just, as we wrap it up here, a couple questions have come in. Julius says, might voice teachers end up being leaders in evidence-based teaching among all instrumental specialties, thanks to our notoriously invisible instruments, because of the challenge of translation? And she says, Lynn Helding mentioned something with challenge of translations.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Wow, that's quite an interesting idea. I mean, it is. It's a fascinating idea, but I think that's why we need the science. Is that we could just take everything that all the evidence that there is now and apply it, and we would be busy for a lifetime.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Or another maybe just a nuts and bolts way of putting it is that I now I have to admit that one of my favorite voice types to teach are high baritones and tenors. And the reason they're my favorite to teach right now is because of how much I learned about teaching them from my understanding of acoustics.
Yeah.
Which took, you know, and it takes a while, right? It's not an easy topic, but it's just, there's so much there that I did not experience myself as a female at birth singer, and still don't, that if I just took my direct experience and applied it to those two voice types would probably not work very well.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
I think that's another reason I think that the science is so important. If you really want to teach all of the instrument family, so to speak, and not just your own, you know.
Well, and if I can be a devil's advocate to my own idea here, or my own supposition here, that's also evidence for the need for pedagogy informing the science and saying we don't have enough tools for the soprano and the alto because we've been focusing on acoustics and physiology of the high male voice for decades, and because we were studying ourselves, frankly.
Catherine wants to know if there's a particular text that is a good starting point for vocal physiology and acoustics. I'm sure we all have our favorites, our own, but I think it kind of depends on the person's interests and needs a little bit.
Well, I use Scott McCoy's book.
Yeah, me too.
Your Voice, an Inside View, third edition.
Third edition, because it has Lynn Helding's chapter on cognition. So I agree. That's the one I teach my pet out of.
And it also has beautifully done graphics this time around for the physiology. So.
And of course, specifically for acoustics, Ken's two books. Thank you, Edri, for, you know, that goes without saying. And of course, Ingo Tietze and Kari Bertolini's book, Vocology book, you know, that goes without saying. But that's what I mean. It kind of depends on the person's need.
We would be remiss if we did not mention our hostess' new book.
Meant to have
Kari
your
Ragan's book.
I meant to have your new book out too, which is just astounding.
Oh, it's right here.
Thank you. Thank you. The music. And Ken, we were just talking about your book as well. As we get ready to wrap it up, though, I want to give Ken a chance to finish his thought if he remembers. Oh no, you're muted.
Oh, he's muted. Oh no, you're muted. Oh dear. No, still muted.
Am I muted still?
No, there you are.
Oh, this has not been my evening for technology.
You've done great.
Well, what I started to say was, in reference to what Lynn Maxfield was saying, that vocal pedagogy is not science's job. So it's only when we're looking for scientific studies focused on vocal pedagogy that we need pedagogy informed science, because as you pointed out, I mean, that's not the primary job of voice science. You know, it has a whole range of goals and objectives. Anyway, the other piece that I wanted to throw out, and maybe this is opening a can of worms we don't need to go into tonight, but this gets back to actually Julia Bentley's question earlier on about terminology. And just my take on this. There is a move, or there's always interest in defining the terms very exactly so that we're all talking and communicating very clearly with each other. I get that. But I think that there can also be a tendency to push that too far. Science needs very precise terminology. It's very clearly agreed upon of all the people that are doing those projects. I don't feel that way so much about pedagogy. We do need to be able to understand each other and have enough common ground in our vocabulary. But as a colleague in Britain, Alex Ashworth, has pointed out from various studies, all language is metaphorical. all language is metaphorical. It's representing something other than the sounds and the symbols that we use. And I think we could be a little bit more magnanimous with each other and not, you know, insist that everybody call it chest voice or mode 1 or modal, or, you know. In my own work, I have tried to find continuities between historic terminology and what we're learning from voice science and other places. And I do try to connect them. So for example, you know, voce accusa, voce aperta, terms like that have been historically used. My feeling is this: teachers that use historic terminology that was very descriptive, frankly, of subjective sensations, for the most part, trained a lot of successful singers. When I had trained as many successful, I'll say in my lane, opera singers as they have, then I'll be maybe feel cocky enough to diss their terminology. Meanwhile, I'm actually looking for continuity with the great teaching and great singing that went on before me. And I might choose to adapt and maybe not use some of the terminology, but I'm not going to get on a high horse about it. So I'm not so much on this, we have to all use the same objective terminology, a horse. I think that we do need to, I think the conversations are very useful because we do need to understand each other in these conversations. But there's a little bit of a side issue, but I wanted to throw that out as well as a part of the teacher experience.
I like that, Ken, and I agree. When I'm in the studio, I do not care what, you know, as long as the student and I are on the same page about what I mean by what I say, then fine.
Right.
I think we want to strive in written pedagogy to, you know, to try to be on the same page. That will speed, you know, make more efficient writing. But in practice, who the heck cares how many registers you say there are? You know, right. Get yourselves on the same page between you and your student, and you know, and go from there.
Yeah,
we just don't need terminology police. In my opinion.
I agree. I'll start walking the halls with a little siren. You know. You said flagellant.
Well, you guys, thank you for continuing this conversation. And I think it's so ironic that we did, and this is my responsibility, spend a lot of time somewhere. We keep coming back to voice research or voice science in this conversation, which is so interesting. But I do just want to say for the record on this webinar that if people think when they see evidence-based voice pedagogy or the shorthand EBVP, I want that to just roll off everyone's tongue. It took me a while, just so you know, but EBVP, you know, that when you see somebody talk about EBVP or evidence-based voice pedagogy, if you are conflating that with voice science or voice research alone, you are missing the boat. You know, that we really want to move the conversation forward with all three components needing to, you talked about this, Lynn, that it just could live on a pinwheel, you know, that there's no hierarchy to it, and they all need to grow in tandem together. And that's how we become the best voice teachers, I think, the most effective voice teachers.
With the pinwheel analogy, if one side gets too lopsided, it won't spin.
Yeah.
So make sure they all do grow at the same, you know.
Thank you for that. What a perfect ending to this. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I wish everybody happy holidays, and here's to a good 2021. Speaking of 2021, please join us January 10th, Dr. Nicholas Perna, Marcy Rosenberg, and we are going to discuss singers and self-laryngeal manipulation, what singing teachers need to know. So please join us January 10th for that. And thank you all for attending tonight. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thanks.